I'm the president of Advocacy for Men and Boys. Welcome to our event, Cut Health and Get Help. Again, UFB would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditionally unceded territories of Métis people. And quick outline, Jeff is just going to do his presentation. And for future events that we're having at UFB Advocacy for Men and Boys, we are planning to have a couple of socials a little bit later in the term, as well as a pre-exposure prophylaxis campaign that are running probably January and February of next year. So Jeff is registered with the British Columbia College of Social Workers and is also a member of the BC Association of Social Workers. He completed a clinical master's of social work at UBC Okanagan, where he studies focused on mental health, addiction, and mental health. So, anything to you?
Yeah, that's what I did. Be here. I'm really happy with the stuff that's happened with mental health. I started this line. I'm only going to do about 15, 20 minutes. I'm not a big talker. I'm a social worker, so I can actually talk for days. BSW, bullshit worker, MSW, more. And if I had a PhD, I'd just pile higher and deeper, right? But I'm not into research, so I'm not going to pile any higher and deeper. So I need to thank the group for inviting me. Like I said, I'm really honored, and I think it's great. The focus on boys and men. When I first started thinking about this stuff, let's see if I got this right. There we go. Was around 1995 when I was doing my undergrad with social work. We were talking about how women, when they're older, are really poor. And I said, well, that's really crappy that women, when they're older, are poor, right? Like, that's not good. I said, where are the men? Oh, they're dead. Okay. And I kept going. I didn't think that was a good health outcome. But most of the reason the women were poor because their pensions and everything went with the men at the time. But that was kind of left, and so I left it, and then off we went to later. And so I'm going to go through some stuff just around some general men's health stuff, and then talk about some ideas that smaller communities can do. I think sometimes we look at the stuff in Toronto and Vancouver. I see Trent University's there, my old place in Peterborough, so that's nice. They have a group as well. They have a nice little river there, the Autonomy. I used to roll down it all the time. But a little bit about my background before I get there. So some of my history is around, I started addictions around 1999, mental health. As I said earlier, I worked in a daycare as well. I've also worked with sexual offenders, although not at the same time. That would be tough. Did foster care stuff for about a decade for youth, trying to move them into independent living. And one of the things we found out about that actually is these were kids that really were in foster care and had the idea was they couldn't live in foster care. They just were, for whatever reason, not appropriate. These called level 3 kids. But after they left, they all went back home. That's how strong the family was, even though they were taken away from home. And home wasn't necessarily healthy, but that's how tight the bond is, I think, right? I've also done stuff with fathers, of course, and when I got into this work, as I said earlier, I think to you is around, or maybe it was to you, I forget who I was talking to, I have short-term memory issues, it's not because of THC. Although I do, I'm quite interested in cannabis research and done that for a while too. Not practical, theoretical. Just to be clear. But when I got into this work, I started looking at men's stuff in Kamloops. The first place I went to was the Kamloops Women's Resource Center. Because I wanted to make sure it wasn't a competing discourse around who's got it worse. That wasn't my idea. And so I went to them right away and said, this is what I'm doing, just so you know. I don't want people yelling and throwing rocks at me. How do we do this together? How do we do it shoulder to shoulder? How do we do it collectively? Because it's not us against you. It's not queer against bi, against hetero. It's not black versus white. We all need to kind of run at this together as people. And so I was lucky I knew some people there. And so they were sympathetic to me and my ideas, if not completely my cause. So one of my general, Andre, hey, you made it. Just in time. My general thesis in this is that part of the binary we look at for men and women is that women are caregivers and men kind of do things. And I think that is one of the major problems for men in getting help is that we're not seen as caregivers. We're seen as nice secondary caregivers when mom's not there. Dad can hold the baby for a bit and then give it back to mom who actually knows what she's doing. And I think that goes through the whole system. When we look at mental health, when we look at social work and other programs, how many men are in that? And so not that you need to be a man to work with men. Let me be clear. I don't believe that. There's this idea in addictions, for example, that you need to be an addict to work with addicts. Okay, I don't believe you need to have schizophrenia to work with schizophrenia people. And so it really falls apart when you start looking at some other areas. I think it might be helpful, but I think it's one of the challenges of our work is there's not enough men in the front lines, or management maybe, in other areas. One of the research documents first put around 2010, the Canadian Men's Health Foundation, by Dan Bilsker. He's a physician. He talked about, he started looking at the numbers for men's health, and he's been a physician, worked in ER most of his life, and he never even thought about men as having a problem around suicide or other things. He just thought that's what men do. That's how ingrained it is in us, right? So, so this is a picture from a Barrier Fall Fair. And narrative is important, I think, when we talk about equality, and words we use are important. Now, sometimes we get really caught up in it, but of course, when you have a relationship with someone, you can say things you can't say to people in public. And that's what relational pieces are about. But I think when you look at mom and baby things, and just as we said, dads only, it changes the story a bit, right? So we need to kind of move that way. So the socialization of boys, really well known. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this kind of stuff because I think it's, I'm speaking of converted here. Very hegemonic, right? We're stoic, tough, self-reliant, etc. And those are the things that get in the way of us seeking help. But in some ways, it's also, I think, how service providers in the community looks at men and blames men. Because we're socialized to be stoic and take care of ourselves. And so when we don't ask for help and don't go out and people put out services for men, we don't access it. They say, well, men didn't want it. So that's their own damn fault. It's kind of like blaming women for being caregiving and bringing them up as caregivers and saying, well, that's their fault for caregiving. We wouldn't blame the victim that way. And I think we blame the victim this way when we talk about violence and aggression and some other areas as well. There's this good thing talking about this that reminds me of a study I saw in Wales when I was doing grad studies around socialization and what we want. And it was around adolescent women. They said, so who really bothers you in school? All the boys who are like loud and obnoxious and those dudes, class clowns. Okay. Who are you attracted to out of school? Well, the boys are loud, obnoxious, and the class clowns. And so it's kind of the same things we have, I think, with women at times around anorexia and this kind of perfect body stuff around, no, we don't like that, but we expect that. So you get this kind of really mixed message that happens for people. And I think that's something we need to just pay attention to. And I think we can do that in ways. But it's a common issue. So real men in counseling. Funny, it's comic. I'll be frank. As a counselor, more men come in to me crying because they have to see me than their life's falling apart. They're so upset that they have to see a counselor that because a wife, doctor, whatever is sending them in isn't the issue. It's just that they had to come. They couldn't take care of themselves, right? I always say, men, people generally come to counseling for 4 reasons. One is mandated. My wife told me, boss told me. The other one is to see if they're crazy. Honestly, Jeff, I'm feeling like something like this. Am I crazy? And generally, people are in crazy situations, which makes them feel like they're crazy. It's not that they're necessarily crazy, although there's some challenges like that, and I'm going to kind of narrative around that. Hold yourself accountable. Drug addiction stuff, right? I don't want you alcohol, so you come to see me just like you would an accountant. And the other one is to puke, get things out. And we find that once you do that, you feel better. Men aren't really good at that. We're better at stuffing. So that's one of the release valves that you would have on a rice cooker that would really work for men, but we don't use it too well when we self-implode. And the perception of counseling, again, like men's health about being vulnerable, not really good at that. And the other part is around some of the stories we hear around names, so people think of stuff. And one of the common narratives I hear is around, remember that story about sticks and stones? Six stones break your bones and names will never hurt you. Well, I've never heard more bullshit in my life, frankly, because all that hurts you are names. When I work with women who have came from abusive situations, they'll tell me the broken ribs, broken nose, and battered bodies isn't what sticks with them. It's being called names. I'm not justifying the other stuff. That's not cool either. But the stuff that sticks with you over a long time is that. That's what you hold within you, right? I believe I can talk about that. Resistance. So, a couple of things I think that are really at the key of men's challenges. is men's isolation from their feelings. When we talk about socialization, people know I talk about social isolation, people being by themselves, not socially connected. We have a real habit for men to do this. Men caves, right? They go by themselves, go out in solitary areas. And I akin it mentally to solitary confinement in some ways, because we don't have that kind of release valve to talk to people and do things. And we have a similar effect, although low level, over time I think has a significant effect on our mental health and our physical body. The suppression of feelings. You know how tough it is to drink feelings away? I don't know, it's really, really tough. It takes a toll on you, right? And people with drug and alcohol issues, and men have a lot of them, is when you have a drug and alcohol problem, it's not because drugs are making you feel good or bad, it's because you're using them not to feel. And for a lot of men, that's what it gets to, right? There's this one quote in some research I was looking at, and they said, some guy, they're doing this focus group, he says, I don't know, there's nothing that, no problem I have that a 12-pack and a lap dance won't fix. It's pretty sad, but, and I'd suggest here's other challenge with men is around feelings, and again around suppressing emotion. I think I always say men are allowed to have 4 feelings. Happy, horny, hungry, and angry. God forbid when they come together. But angry is when we're allowed to feel. So if we're feeling bewildered, I'm angry. If I'm really disappointed, well, I'm still angry. When you look at, and I'll get to this later, around assessing depression, it's a real issue for men as well. When you look at social isolation, for people even that didn't think consider themselves lonely, the likelihood of death increased by 25% of people who, 26%, sorry, of people who are socially isolated. And so you think about men or boys, right, spending a lot of time by themselves in solitary activities. Or if they are with men, really kind of, even men when we're older, we do a lot of parallel play. When we parallel play, kids play together when they're really little, not really. I think men often do that as well in the bar. They talk about each other, but not really a whole bunch else. And there's also some really good evidence coming out around trying to get men into counseling, for example. It's easier to go through women because they're more in tune with their emotions, because men have been shutting that out and don't even know what it is when it comes up. And you think about the challenge around being in control of yourself. Anyone's ever had a good cry fit? Right? It's a bit uncontrolling. If you're not used to emotions, it's not something you can kind of logically go through. And so it's terrifying for men to have these emotions that go up, from fear to other things. And so I think that's one of the challenges with men, is we can't even identify when it is a problem. When we do, it's often really late. I'll get to that in a second. Right there. This is kind of how men get the help seeking. Should have probably came in a bit earlier. Men typically come into healthcare services late in an acute phase. How men get help is their wife, sister, mother, daughter bring them to emerge. Right? I started collecting stories around some of my colleagues around some of the things their dads did for health. And one of my buddies had a story. I think it's funny, it's sad, but his dad had this thing on his tongue. Wasn't too sure what it was. Ate KFC all the time. Wasn't necessarily anything else, but he did eat well and other things. But went to his doctor and said, I've got a thing on my tongue. What is it? He said, well, you got to go see a specialist. Well, you can't fix it? Well, that's it. I finally got to a doctor and you can't do anything. Well, I'm not going. No. Take that. Okay. 2 years later, he goes in. It's got bigger. They had to remove this piece of his tongue and put part of his thigh there. So now he's got his tongue that doesn't work and hairy. So now he talks funny. He's got a hairy tongue. So he's really mad at the doctors and everyone else, but he never took care of himself, right? And I'm sure we all have stories of guys who just keep going through life until they die, right? My dad was out, I flew him out in the summer because that's what's going to happen to him. End of the day, he's an alcoholic, he drinks, smokes all the time, that's probably the way he's going to go. And he still can't cry. Can't cry to save his life. So when we look at help seeking, one of my things, I think men come in to go to the doctor or a healthcare professional for 2 reasons. And they're both masculine reasons. One is they can't get up and go to work. The other one is they can't get it up in bed. Those are the kind of 2 reasons men will go. And men's health started from urology services. That's where all the researchers came from. Or the men's health movement largely came from urologists. But I think we're more than penises and prostates, I think. One of the ways we can help men, and we'll get into some of the areas where I think that we can engage men in novel ideas, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But generally one of the ways we can hook men in is when it's a way to restore another more valued enactment of masculinity. So going to work. So if you want to, or be strong in bed. So if you really want to have a great heart on, dude, quit smoking. That's how it works. Oh, okay. They're more likely to do that. You want to exercise? You'll be stronger. You'll be able to go to work more. Okay, yeah, I can do that. Just exercise doesn't make sense. But to do it another way might. And so that's often one of the hooks we get men in. Just doing it for good sake doesn't not enough for men. So, a few areas quickly for intervention, I think, where we can help men, and a couple areas where I specifically focus on. One is dads. 80% of men will become a dad at some point in their life. So that's an important one, I think. And it's an area, if you've ever seen someone with a new dad, and then being a new dad, I've seen this and felt myself, where all of a sudden you have a real sense of purpose. Shit gets real. Really quick, right? Like it does. Or you don't see your kid, that's the way it goes, right? If you can't figure it out, that's kind of the way it goes. And the other one is around mental health. But I think we also need to look at things from a stage of change continuum. People familiar with stages of change? So you have these kind of different ideas. One's pre-contemplative. Jeff, you have a problem. No, I don't. Okay, pre-contemplative. Jeff, I think you drink too much. Yeah, but I work really hard. Yeah, but contemplative. Yeah, but. Then we get kind of into the preparation phase. Well, okay, well, I'm going to quit drinking on New Year's. So New Year's is the action phase, and then you get to maintenance. Maintenance is probably the most difficult part. But I think we often miss engaging people in the pre-contemplative stage and contemplative stage on health behaviors. Tobacco companies do a really good job of it, and drug companies do. Hey, you just want to try one cigarette? Here, try this. This really helps. It'll be fun tonight. Contemplate. You thinking about smoking? You think about having a drink? Try this little flowery drink that doesn't really taste like alcohol. Contemplative people moving. But often our services, and I'll say for school systems, when I work with kids who suspend from school, what they used to do is and this is a great story around how men or boys are treated in school. So in Kamloops, if you're suspended, say, for smoking pot at school, what would happen is you used to get suspended for 10 days, kick you out and off you go. Good luck coming back. The chronic pot smoker who's having challenges, that pretty well some 30 years. Because they're just not that far ahead anyway. So we said, well, how about we go see a counselor, engage them in the community, that really helps, and send them to a school where they go to get caught up in the work. Great. But if you get caught, you're not, in the school district, you're not allowed to partake in sporting activities after that for the rest of the year. Okay. But you can do drama, you can do chess club, you can do band, but sports activities you can't. When we talk to them about that, what that means, number one is how do you keep kids not using drugs? If I got nothing else to do, why don't I smoke a joint if I can't play hockey? Like, really? But the other challenge was around just who that targets, and disproportionately targets boys, I think. And we need two other things. We need to move away from the silos, and I guess a lot of my work has moved. I started moving into health promotion and prevention. In social work, we have this idea that as a clinician and working with people who are suicidal and having psychotic breaks and are really in a lot of trouble, we're pulling people out of the river and saving them. At some point, you got to go up the river and figure out who's throwing them in or how they're falling in. Right? That's kind of the idea around prevention. But they're all from way apart, and I think we need to move them together so we have a better idea on how we can dovetail those together so they're not so siloed approaches. Because they're both going toward the same goal. And part of the way to do that is through, I think, looking at community-oriented areas. So really broad spectrum programs are neat across the country, but they're probably not going to work that well for each little area. So a couple areas I think are a huge issue. Violence is a health problem. When we talk about violence, generally we talk about violence against women. People here, again, I'm speaking with converted, we know that of the missing murdered Aboriginal folks, during that time frame, 71% of them are men that are missing or murdered. They're not included in that group, but they make up the bulk of the people. When you look at suicides, when you look at, for example, depression, men are diagnosed with depression a third of the rate as women. We kill ourselves 3 times as much. Partly that's because we can't identify those negative feelings. Partly is we don't go for help. And the third part I suggest is when we do, people don't identify it. And It's part of our assessment tools and our approach to men. 80% of suicides in BC are men. But anger isn't just that. I think of anger inward as depression. Anger towards yourself. Anger outward is violence. And since men, remember those 4 feelings we have? That's one we're often allowed to have. And so that's a predominant one, that we either take things out on ourselves, because we're so stupid, we don't know enough, and we kind of hold ourselves together, that we kill ourselves. And actually the highest rate for suicide right now is 40 to 50-year-old men. Particularly if you lose your job, you're really at risk. Alberta's got a huge problem, right, as a result of that. So drug misuse, right? One of the things I think about violence, and I've worked with a lot of guys who've been in gangs, from Hells Angels to Scorpions to whoever. And I don't know many of them, you get paid in that business because it's a dangerous business, right? It's danger pay, that's what you get paid for. But not a lot of them really like the violence and having to go into that every day and every night, knowing that they're looking over their shoulder. I remember working with one young guy who had patches of hair he had to comb over because his hair was falling out because of stress. He was so stressed about he's going to have the stuff knocked out of him that night, next night, yesterday, who knows when. Around the next corner, the threat of violence, real violence, was so real that his body, he was 19, he was young, he shouldn't have top of his game. But he wasn't able to do it. And so I think that's a huge issue across the board. You think about young men and the violence they face. My teenage boy, I think about this thing years ago, a buddy of mine, Doug Broadfoot, said, let's stop violence against women and children. What about my son who's 16? I guess he's not a part of it, eh? And that's really part of the problem we have, is that we allow that to happen. So here's a quick graph just around kind of a 5-stage model of counseling for men. And the only really difference in this compared to other things is there's a little bit longer rapport and therapeutic alliance building. You know, when I was talking about the school system, kids would be referred to us and they'd be contemplative. I don't think I have a problem. The teachers want us to move them right into action right away. So you're doing something about that? Well, no, actually they kind of like smoking pot. They don't like their antidepressants. It really kind of does weird things. They'd rather smoke pot. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying it's what it is. But people want us to move right away. When you don't, you're not being successful. But for men, because they're not really good at engaging in this and not really comfortable, or they don't trust. Right? Are you going to share my feelings with someone? Are you going to share my sexuality issues? Right? When you look at rape, for example, men that have been sexually abused, bisexual men are by far disproportionate in that. Why that is, I'm not too sure, even more than gay men. And truly, a lot of the men I work with also have those issues in their history. My dad would be one as well. But it's not brought up, it's not talked about, it's not something you deal with, it's just something you get over. Right? So this kind of lays out kind of that piece, and then you get an assessment. Typically when you go into a place, I'm trying to find a picture around counseling, but all the pictures had some with a checklist kind of that you do, right? Like you're doing a prostate exam, and I don't know about you, I don't use those, I don't like them, they're not, I don't care. It's not that I don't care. Depression assessments, like I said, the Beck's inventory, other ones, they're often more geared in the assessment stage towards women and women's feelings, how women would present depression, how they've been socialized to express depression and feelings of sadness versus men. Men express it angrily. And so when men come in angrily, often then they get cut off for services because they're violent. I'll talk about this later on child protection, how that plays in. For men, I'd suggest one of the things is, again, we talk about making them more engage in other masculine activity. And so, activating things, not how you're feeling, what are you thinking about doing? Let's do something. And sometimes we need to change what that is. And you're talking about kind of the mindfulness, right? Side effects of mindfulness are really good, like they're really limited, kind of like yoga. Nothing bad about it, it's like soup, right? Really good. But some dudes try to get them to do yoga. I'm not doing that foo-foo crap, bunch of people stretching. All right, brother, that's all right. How about scuba diving? Because you can't be anxious when you're scuba diving, or things are going to go poorly. So if you have the funds and the ability, scuba diving is a great way to get into. And when I'm sending people to a course, you gotta breathe, you just gotta relax, right? And so it's another way to activate, do something, be manly, but be calm. Right? Sometimes it's really around harm reduction. For men, again, slight moves. I used the pot example before when we look at domestic violence, where places where cannabis has been legalized or people that use cannabis more, couples, rates of violence really go down. Again, partly it's just a side effect of alcohol, right? Its effects are quite different than cannabis, and so you don't fight as much. Maybe over cheeseburger, but it's not quite as violently engaged, right? And your memory issues and the rest. One of the problems, of course, alcohol is you have a couple, you think you're okay, you have a couple more, and then you kind of not too sure where you're at. So moving people that way, or another one, for example, alcohol. People that don't want to drink, or say, look, I want to cut down my drinking, but I don't want to stop. So what do? Well, unless you're Irish, I'd suggest try Guinness. Trying to get drunk and that stuff's really tough. Like they sell them in a 4-pack, it's like stew. By the time you get through 4, you're just tired. Unless you're really, again, North Atlantic stuff, and then that might not be the best issue, but we need to tailor our things that way. So subgroup traits are really important in cultures that go with that, right? Taking out, young guys I work with that have a lot of anger, you go into a mosh pit, nothing wrong, off you go. Take out some energy there, right? That's fine. So looking at population health and health promotion messages, within this diagram, different places you can intervene. So being around it, looking at the assessment around, they're mostly geared towards women, and our healthcare largely is, because that's who shows up, right? Remember I talked earlier about how we kind of blame the victim for men around because they don't show up because they're being stoic, so that's their fault. We wouldn't want to say that for anyone else, but some of the other things is being positive around male traits. Often men come into place and they're kind of, our alcohol and drug system is still very much like this. It's very shame and blame oriented. As much as we like to say it's not, it's still very much a shame and blame oriented system. And men feel like that when they go in and talk about their violence or other issues or their depression, they feel like they're being blamed for it. Instead of building up some of the characteristics that we really like about men. If we're going to war, who gets drafted first? Right? Army, those kind of things. Men have some really great traits. When you look at workplace deaths, men account for 95, 97% of them. That's because we do dangerous jobs. That's why. We need someone to do power lines, to log, to do that. So we need to build up some of the positive strengths in men, and then how can we just kind of massage them a bit so that they're not sort of detrimental to them and other people around them. And so we need to work on that, but often we're not, because we've heard so many bad things about men and what they do that we just need to wag our finger at them and tell them to be different, right? Also, it's not so much face-to-face. Men don't really, not always so good at that. They're better at shoulder-to-shoulder. Going for a walk with guys. Anyone ever work with youth, for example, other people driving a car? Man, you get some great conversations that way. Just shut your mouth. Kids will tell you stuff they don't want you to know. Hey, you were where? Talk later. And throw some humor in. Sometimes this stuff's fun. I think sometimes we get very serious, and it could be just my bias in that. And it's around rapport as well, because sometimes I think we get very serious about what's happening in people's life, and they are. But people get dark humor around that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing when you have that rapport to work with them. And it lightens it up. And also remember, because cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the main therapies we use as counselors, that works really well for men. What are you thinking? What do you do? Go. Check, check, done. Who cares about your feelings? Next. Right? So we don't need to get into some of that stuff that we're often necessarily trained to get people in. Tell me about your feelings. How's it going? Oh, wow, geez, that was Whew. No. So build on the good parts. So I think it's good to look at some of the local things that we can do to engagement. Again, the counseling approach, largely the same for everybody, right? It's Rogerian kind of stuff. You got to be present. You got to be there. When you look at what makes change, skills are about 15% of it. It's the rapport is the main part. The second main part is what they call extra therapeutic factors. Shit we have nothing to do with. The community, the family, their nutrition level, their cognitive ability, a bunch of those things. So most of it has nothing to do with the skills we have. Now, as a clinician, I also need to be aware that I'm not triggering people, particularly like post-traumatic stress disorder. I suggest men face that. You think about violence as being one of the factors, and men are far more likely to be, men are violent, but I'm more likely to be beat up than someone else, than the women are. That's just the reality. But I know the guy. Don't get me wrong. But so when you look at trauma, men are very much exposed to it, but we don't report it or experience it in the same way. And I'm not necessarily saying we deal with it better. I'm not saying that. But looking at some different things we can do around engaging men in those contemplative, pre-contemplative areas to make health okay and fun. Can health be fun? I don't know. Does it always help me heavy? And this is the other part around real localized stuff. This one's always funny around subcultures. Drop. Northern Health did this thing called power play. They work with men in camps, because working with men and helping men in their health at workplace, again, a masculine thing, has great evidence. Because they want to stay at work, they want to keep working, they want to make sure they're doing well at work. So anyway, they did this thing around these kind of pictures and some graphs around pamphlets around how to help men. They put a truck in there, and one of the guys said in a focus group, nobody would drive a truck around here. What truck's that? Now, I have a blue car. I have no idea what kind of truck they would drive up there, but to me it just speaks to how we need to be attuned to what men do in the local context. Right? When you look at Aboriginal communities, it's very much tribe to tribe, and I think community to community have certain nuances we can play with. And that's a good one that always reminds me of that. So I'm going to go through some different areas and age groups of where we can help men and some things we might be able to do. So newborns, well, we do it differently, right? Remember I said, I think one of the major problems for men is we're not seen as caregivers or adequate caregivers. And that's for a good reason. When I was born, my dad wasn't allowed in the delivery room. Even if he wanted to be, even if he left the bar, he wouldn't be allowed there. I was in the delivery room and changed my kid's first diaper. I have a significantly different relationship with my son as a result. But newborns and dads, 80% of men will be dads at some point in their life. That's a huge group. And it intervenes right at the get-go. So the son gets the benefit, or the daughter all the way up, of a relationship with a man, and the man gets a relationship with the kids, where he can expose himself, and he has a reason to be more woman-like, to be emotional, to care, to care-give. And so he has a legitimate out to do those things. And men I know are far better off when they're involved in that. Their health is far better. I would suggest that men are the single most under-resourced part of the family and in our community that we have. When we look at child protection, I said this earlier around when child protection services are involved, and I remember talking to a bunch of social workers saying, where are the men? So I remember working with a young guy. His partner wasn't well. She was involved in sex trade, heroin use, a bunch of things. They had a number of kids. He smoked pot, so he wasn't allowed to have the kids. And it took a lot of work to get the kids to be with him, because he wasn't seen as adequate caregiver, because he was a man. The kids went to foster care first before they went with him. When I asked the social worker, so how can we, where are the men? And two reasons. One is, if a woman says he's violent, they just kind of move him off right away. And there's reasons for that, I get that. But there's also around follow-up, due diligence, and professionalism around that. Because a lot of the time, when you look at violence, and then we'll talk about that, it's both partners end up being violent. When you take it away, they're not violent in a different relationship or a different time when they're safe, right? And so they're often not violent with their kids. They have emotional problems with a partner that they need to solve. But the social worker said, the reason we don't, Jeff, follow up with men, we don't have the resources. We can't keep up with the files we have right now. We're so far behind keeping kids safe that if we start chasing men down, now what? Where's our resource? It was an honest answer that that individual would never say on camera, and the ministry would never recommend that is happening, but that's the reality. One of the saddest parts about dads and families for me is, although 80% of people, dads, men, end up having kids, 40% of them will get divorced or separated. That's kind of the rates right now, half, right? For kids in families where mom and dad are separated, only 9% of them spend equal time with both parents. And by that, I mean only 9% of them spend equal time with the father. To me, that's disturbing. I think men can get help, even if they aren't great dads and haven't been. I think they want to be and can be if we allow them to, without criminalizing them. and it would take a lot of burden off our other resources that we're trying to do as well. So that's newborns, dads. We do it differently. And we do parent differently. So some of the things we've done in Kamloops and other areas, Man of the Month. So the idea here was just around building champions of men. So who are the champions in the community, right? So this was kind of for the 24-year-old group, probably, new dads often, and conscious raising around that men are good guys, so let's do something. So we got a bunch of local restaurants give a $50 GC and a plaque to somebody that was recommended by the community. And so we give that to that person every month. And they get to go for dinner just for being a good dad. This is kind of the picture I think of, right? A guy, little girl, pink suit, he's got the worker outfit on, right? Yes, honey, I'll do your hair. I don't know how to do hair. Look at him, he doesn't have it. Right? So that's one area. Strength of being a boy. I put that up there in Kamloops. This is going to happen next year. This is kind of 10 to 15-year-olds. Power of being a girl has happened for 15 years in Kamloops for this age group. And we get girls together from school, and we get them to do a whole bunch of things for a couple days to really kind of build themselves up. Next year is going to be the first one for men, for boys. I think that's fantastic. Again, 10 to 15-year age group, what do we do to engage them in? We can be good guys. We're helpful. What are some things we can do, right? Know your numbers is a campaign. This is often for the 19 to kind of 30-year-olds. So what we do with Know Your Numbers is we go to bars. We take nurses. We get a little pad called, it's called a prescription for health, I call it. We do the blood glucose, BMI, weight, all those kind of things. Write it down and give it to them. Just so they know. And it's a way to engage men, particularly in that age bracket, who don't go to the doctor, right? Now, typical men stuff, what do they do? So, one of the guys I remember, we got to get him on the scale. So he's got his work phone, he's got his wallet, takes off his jacket, he's got his beard, he steps on the scale. So what are you going to do with your beard? Oh, right. That's men's health, right? But it's a great way to enter into a conversation with men around health and what happens. Some guys look at it and go, wow, what's that mean? Oh, that's not good. Or you get the other guys who go, so you're diabetic, yeah? So what are you drinking? Vodka and water. I can't drink pop anymore, man. Like that stuff just does a number on me. All right. But again, a way to engage men into a novel situation, not a lot of time, bit of fun. And of course, you always get the guys too. They'll have a beer and then get the blood glucose. What happens if I have a couple more? I'll come back. All right, come back. Get it again, see where, and have some fun with it again, right? And that's our health minister who was nice enough to show up to do that. He was a club starter in Vancouver. This is for social isolation, again, because social isolation leads to depression to a large extent. And this is just a club around men get together and talk about dudes' issues. So we'll try one of those as well with really marginalized men over 40 who are street entrenched. You can also do fun things around gender. I think I said at the beginning where when I first started this, I went to the women's resource group in Kamloops and said, look, I want to do some stuff around men, but it's not us against you. Right? It's not that. And so some of the diversity things. So this is a thing called, what was this called? Misjudged. So we had a number of people. On one side, we have a 71-year-old guy who started an autism school in Kamloops. We have a local municipal politician there. We have some service providers and other nice folks who showed up. A nice blue-collar guy who works in engineering as well. And we did a drag show, essentially. Now, some people really get offended by that. Why would we do that? Why do we have to do those types of things? I understand those arguments. To me, again, it's fun. We've got to raise some money. I'll tell you, my bathing suit show wasn't that great. My gown wasn't so hot either. And I was more belly than I was dance. But it was a lot of fun for my piece. Right? But men don't mind some of this. You think about Halloween. How many guys dress up as women on Halloween, right? It's always a fascinating sociological piece. And so when we talk about those binaries of gender, I think there's areas we can move that and play with it and have fun. And again, move men out of just being men. Right? This is that, which is the thing we did around, you ever heard of vagina monologues? So it's a story we do around, or women do around violence against women, right? And so there's an alternate piece called Memory Monologue, Rant and a Prayer. And so one year we did that in combination with them. And again, with a bunch of people just trying to raise awareness, right? That men can do that. Some gender-specific stuff. Broca. Sometimes men don't want to go to a group with a bunch of women, partly because they might feel like they're a bit creepers because they don't know the move and they're trying to look over someone's shoulder in yoga pants. So you can do male-specific stuff with a whole bunch of real non-bendy guys. And I mentioned the scuba one, right? And then you need to engage local politicians, right? We have this thing going on in BC, Battle Royale right now, Prince George versus Kamloops. And engaging different people around trying to raise money. And I saw there's a campus radio station here, so I put that up. You engage local people too. It's called On the Dope, a radio show directed completely at men. Or not men, at campus community demographic. One of the things I always like doing when I did the show is asking people, if you're a drug, what drug would you be? Anyone heard of Gabor Mate? He does a lot of really good stuff around trauma and treatment and a bunch of things. He's really got into kind of ayahuasca and a bunch of other things now. But when I asked him, I said, you're a physician, you can get any drug you want. If you're a drug, what drug would you be? He said, ecstasy. Who would want to be ecstasy? Hey, that's a great little giggle. That's fantastic. So finally, I think my last piece is just around training service providers. I think there's a huge gap in our understanding of men and how to address men as men. And not treat them as someone else, not trying to be someone different, and build up their strengths as men. Child protection workers, right? Again, someone takes my kids away, I'm probably really depressed and sad. How's that going to show up as a guy? Angry. So all of a sudden then I'm not allowed service. That doesn't make my kid's life any better. Right? And so we need ways. Men can't be violent, but if they're yelling and stuff, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be violent. They're frustrated. And that's the way that we'll train them to be. So let's just chill out a bit and get them to calm down, and we have a discussion with them. They might be upset, rightfully so, something's gone wrong, but we need to help them. And I think when we look at a whole bunch of areas, from health to child welfare, school programs around how we deal with boys, right? Now, we love medicating boys with ADHD. I'm not sure why boys are so hyperactive these days. They weren't in the past, but it's a real issue. And depression, again, right? How does that show for boys? So dealing with men the best way we can, and teaching in schools. I don't know about other people here in their training. When I went through social work, it wasn't that long ago, we did a lot of stuff around special populations. Men weren't even part of it, and there's good reason, because historically all the research was done on men and generalized to women and everyone else in the 50s and 40s and up to the 60s. That's changed dramatically now. Canada has one of the few places in the world, the CIHR, federal research arm, that does gender-specific research. Out of that, only 30% of the research is done on men. Just because people aren't applying to it. Not because people don't care, I think, it was researchers, but it's not a topical issue, right? So I think those are things we need to look at as far as service providers. How do we do that? And what are our next steps as far as engaging men to be thinking about health? Because once they do, then they're able to come to a counselor like me without crying so much and actually get some benefit out of it. Because I'll be honest, once a guy shows up and he talks for a bit, I say, that's all I need. Weird, eh? But for them, that can be a little bit daunting to start with, that they even have to make that. Luckily, I have an office that's in a back alley around somewhere, no one sees you come in. It's, kind of like a gambling den or something, I think they're going to. But, anyway, that's my little piece on what I think men's work is and some of the things we can do to help them. Thank you, and I'm curious about any conversation you'd like to have.